whole healthcare industry is going to change dramatically in the next couple of years.
To chronic disease management and the preventative aspect of care.
AI can now understand the key clinical concepts of what's being verbalized in healthcare.
Welcome to Leaders in Healthcare. I'm Dr. Jordan Vollrath, physician, entrepreneur, and Chief Medical Officer for Cherry Health. We're talking about all things healthcare. Join us as we speak to innovators, industry leaders, and the people working to drive the healthcare system forward. Sean is a discretionary portfolio manager, certified financial planner, and founder of Moraine Wealth Advisory. Sean's also licensed in life insurance and a member of the Financial Planning Association of Canada. Last time on the podcast, me and Sean talked about some broad topics related to financial planning. Today we're going to dive into cash flow planning with a bit more narrow of a focus on healthy money habits, short-term cash flow, and short-term goals. So with that said, I guess, Sean, where do you want to start?
Well, I think it's pretty safe to say that I think there's a misconception that on average, only, younger professionals have this issue. I think this is something that when you have higher income, you can fall into some traps. Most people don't have a good idea of where their money goes. They know they make a lot of money, but at the end of the month, they're like, I don't know where it all went. So that's the sort of stuff that we're trying to address with this, is setting some good habits. With a digital world where, everything from Apple Pay to, tap, it makes it really easy to just spend and not necessarily pay attention to it. And I think the other thing to touch on is that when we start thinking about, when we're going through our everyday lives, trying to keep track or doing the mental accounting and keeping track of, I spent this year, but you might have forgot 4 or 5 other purchases, and over the course of a month that adds up to be a lot. And I think the other thing is, as physicians, new physicians coming out of school, you typically have a fair bit of debt, and that can put you on a bit of extra pressure when it comes to personal and family finances. I think that's sort of where I would start.
Yeah, so since the last podcast, we've kind of started taking a look at, my own personal finance. And this is definitely like one of the spots that I've found challenging, right? Like you kind of just swipe the credit card. It doesn't seem to really matter. There's always enough cash there to pay off the credit card balance. And then like at the same time, having this like inconsistent income every month, right? Like not a consistent, stable salary every pay period. And then at the same time, coupled with that line of credit, right, the debt that comes from medical school and residency. So that's sort of just like, okay, whatever surplus there is just goes onto that line of credit. And it becomes this completely unstructured revolving door of money. And there's been zero rhyme or reason to actually planning it out. So I would love to chat more about this side of things today. I mean, in terms of the debt itself, what's kind of the average that people are having now?
Well, when you start looking, I pulled some numbers on the Association of Faculties of Medicine in Canada, and in 2023, the average was $98,700. 2022 is only 90, and going back another year before that, it was 80 grand. So, you throw that into the equation. Many people will also have undergraduate debt, so that adds to it. One of the interesting things I thought was, roughly 30%, 32% of the individuals were between $50,000 and $100,000 of debt just related to going to medical school, and over 38.4%, I believe, was greater than $100,000 of debt just related to medical school. So you throw that in along with, say, a longer residency, it's very easy to see how you're, $200,000+. And frankly, the banks love to lend money to, doctors and dentists. Your good credit risk is.
They make it very accessible.
They do. And, so you end up finding yourself, starting off your professional life, somewhat on the back foot financially, in the sense that you've got a lot of debt, and now you've got this huge hole you got to, work your way out of. So I think when it comes to that kind of stuff, it's if you can address the positive or healthy habits with money early, you can kind of move other financial objectives down the road a lot faster for yourself, whether it's debt reduction, getting into your first home, and not, just letting the lifestyle kind of creep up a bit slower than maybe it tends to from time to time.
I've got some catching up to do here. Like, I think some of those numbers you quoted, those sound a little low, and just talking to some of my friends, so maybe we're just overachievers on that front.
All I know is that I never went to med school or dental school, and some of the people I grew up with who were friends with, and they could have a much better lifestyle than I could going through university.
A few too many ski trips, I guess.
Exactly.
They add up quick.
Nicer cars,
Yeah.
holidays, all that kind of stuff, yeah.
How do we start structuring some of the chaos then? Like, especially when it comes to the, I guess, tracking of expenses. This is something that I've also found kind of challenging because I don't really know how to equate the output with the data that gets gathered. So when it comes to that, like, instead of just having the revolving door of the credit card, how do you actually start gathering the data in a structured fashion that'll be useful for you to actually change your budgeting and your actual cash flow?
So I think, there's a lot to unpack there in terms of how I would go about having that discussion. And I think it really comes down to, when we think about how easy it is to just spend conveniently, we're very much we like to just have instant gratification. And when I think of this, I always think of this one skit. I don't know if you've seen it, but Ronnie Chan, who's from Crazy Rich Asians, he has a whole skit on Netflix about Prime Now and how, I want it yesterday. I want you to take it, from wherever, put it in my house, and, before I even think about it. And that's sort of that instantaneous, we want that instant gratification with so many things in our life. And I think the big thing is to start thinking about when we make these emotional purchases, they're often not the right thing to do, but it feels good at the time, and then you often have that buyer's remorse afterwards. So I would say, the big thing is about just changing a little bit of how you go about your day to day and being mindful of, is this emotional, or is this a, sort of a non-emotional expenditure that just, it's like your debt. You have to make the payment. If you don't, there's consequences, right? So I think it's that mindset shift that will make a difference. And I think that's the biggest issue that we have in today's world is, when you think about the way it used to be, we would, go to the ATM or go to the bank even, pull money out, you'd get your little checking book updated, and that's how it used to be. We didn't have this risk of, access to cash the same way that we do today. Now with taps, Apple iPhones even make it harder. So even if you have the discipline, you have your credit cards or whatever on your phone, it doesn't matter if you don't have your wallet, you can still purchase stuff. And that's where I think, training yourself to start thinking a bit more carefully about not using your funds for these emotional purchases or unplanned purchases without kind of stepping back and thinking about where it fits. I think the other really thing to be mindful of is when you go back to, when you make those kind of purchases, you always go back to this notion of, I make a lot of money, but I have no clue where my money goes at the end of the month. And that's not unique to, professionals. This is, I think, everybody, especially when you have higher incomes, you can run into this sort of just lifestyle where you just buy what you want because you want it. It makes you feel good. And before you know it, you start spending a lot of money on things that you maybe shouldn't be, or maybe have regrets for after the fact. So I think that's where I would leave that.
100%. It's easy to just get into that. Okay, tap it. Like, this doesn't seem like a lot, but after a handful of those every month, they start adding up. So yeah, 100%.
Yeah. And I think that's unfortunately a pervasive problem. Not again, it's a pervasive problem with everybody. I think especially when you're getting to the point where you don't have to watch the dollars as much necessarily because you have enough household income. The habits creep in, and then you have to start trying to work on breaking those habits.
Practically speaking, how do you actually start putting together a budget then? Like, I've done this before where you sit down and kind of guesstimate how much you want to spend on things, but then it just didn't really pan out, or it didn't match reality, or maybe it wasn't flexible enough. Like, how do you actually advise clients to go through this process in a way that works?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the thing you got to step back from is the word budget is not how I would like to maybe preface how you would go about managing your cash flow. Budgeting will, typically it brings awareness, but it doesn't necessarily, bring about the right action that you're looking for. And so, when we start thinking about things like budget, it feels very restrictive. It feels like you can't do this or you can't do that. And so it's harder to stick with it. I think, when it comes to a behavioral cash flow plan, what we're really doing is we're aligning sort of your cash flow with some shorter term goals that you will feel good about. And a shorter term goal in this case is not like pay down a bunch of debt. No, a shorter term goal might be having a holiday or a weekend away that you want to plan for. So, I think that's the big thing. And so when we start talking about budgeting, it's restrictive, it's controlling. So, you're giving something up and you're thinking about the sacrifices, and your mindset's always in this more negative sort of what I can't have versus what you can have. And I think when we change that mindset to start thinking about things that you can do with your money, it'll change that situation for you. I think the other thing is that when you think of budgets are really good for projects, things that have a beginning and an end. So, think of renovations, a vacation that you might be saving up for, a gift, or, maybe you want to do some sort of event and you want to plan a party. Well, okay, we have a budget and you stick to it, and then you work backwards, and that's when budgeting works really well, So I think that's where the mind shift has to come.
Yeah, I like what you're saying in terms of what's the other thing, right? Not just what are you giving up, right? Because when I'm looking at it, I'm like, okay, paying down debt, and there's nothing sexy about that, right? You don't get excited for, all right, we're going to get 10% of the student debt paid off this year, right? It's hard to be emotionally invested in that.
Exactly.
And then at the same time, like, I don't know, the part where I've also found it fall apart is, there's just not that enthusiasm about it from the get-go, maybe because I never approached it from that perspective of what is the opposite side of that coin of like what are you giving up, but what are you gaining, and making that a little bit more engaging.
And I think that's where the goals, like tying, and it has to be something that you feel like you can't actually have today.
Yeah.
So what is that reward going to be for that decision? And that's going to help you stick with it, because you have that light at the end of the tunnel. It's not so far away that it's like, okay, I'm going to give up. And I actually think if you have the means, you start thinking about maybe we have something that's more 6 months and maybe one that's more 18 months out. So you kind of have two goals. So you have that shorter term one that will allow you to stay focused on the near term, but also still funding maybe a longer, like not a longer term, but a goal that's more like 18 months out, that will, bridge that step from say 6 months to 18, but it's not from 0 to 18 that you have nothing. It's like you have a little reward early on that then helps you plan for the next one.
You're gamifying it a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so then I want to start putting together my budget or my cash flow planning. How do you start going about that? Like, what's even the approach to get started there?
Yeah, so I think before diving into that, I think it would be really helpful to start thinking about the different approaches that people might have considered in the past. So, there's the fixed expenses and variable expenses approach, and then you'll have sort of a needs versus wants sort of, siloing cash or
your
expenditures.
Fixed costs, right? Like your mortgage payments and your utilities and things, are coming every time. And then you've got like more of the optional.
Yeah, variable could be, I want to go have fun. I'm going to go out every Saturday, or go have a dinner out with friends or whatever, and that could be your variable, or in that case. So I think the approach that I would suggest is to start categorizing your expenditures between emotional risk versus low emotional risk, and I think that will start to help you prioritize those costs. And so examples of the expenses that would be low emotional risk: bills, rent, mortgage, gasoline, debt payments. Right? We're not at risk of spending a lot more on any of those.
And when you say emotional risk, though, what do you mean? Like there's a good chance that this is just an impulse buy and not needed?
I mean, you don't get this sense of happiness from those expenditures. Like when you have to pay your mortgage payment, do you get excited? I don't get excited.
Oh yeah, that thrills me.
Yeah, or you have to pay, so it's those type of expenditures, where the emotional risk comes in things like groceries, where you decide to walk down some of those aisles that we shouldn't, or maybe you're trying to avoid eating out, daily coffees, and again, it comes out. Most people, none of us really like to be on a budget. And I think it's just that it's not a budget. It's just you start to frame your mindset about how you want to have your money working for you.
And so what would I do differently then? Like the grocery bill to me is sort of kind of in that no man's land in the middle, right? It's like you got to buy groceries, but at the same time, like you're framing it with the emotional risk side. Like there's a good chance there's a whole lot of unnecessary stuff in there. Maybe I went down the toy aisle at Costco, and now we're back in that high risk. What do you recommend to actually follow through with your guidelines there, or create your budget there?
So you touched on something that's interesting. You mentioned the toy aisle in Costco. Well, Superstore now has clothing, it has toys, it has a bunch of stuff. All these places have groceries and these other things. So it's easy to kind of go down this rabbit hole or go down the path of spending money on things that you weren't planning on because it's just there. And I think the thing is I think if you go in with, okay, here's what I'm going to get, and you have the discipline, and then also when you start to budget in that weekly time frame versus a month, and you're using not your credit card or just your tap, but you have only so much money in an account. And again, this kind of comes into the whole methodology that I would say would help get rid of some of those unplanned expenditures. You'll be a bit more mindful of where you're spending it, and you'll probably prioritize that spending allowance that you might have in terms of making sure you stay on course. So again, I think the key is making sure that when you're going down that sort of behavioral finance or behavioral budgeting approach, you need to have something as a reward, and it can be revolving. Like you move, you hit the one reward, you apply the next one you can look forward to, and it keeps you on that steady kind of path.
Well, I think the other key there, I guess, would be you got to be looking at it at that weekly cadence, right? So that when you get to Costco, you've already got a pretty good idea of how much of your toy budget's been used up that week.
Yeah.
But doing it monthly, you're sort of pretty far removed from what the actual reality of today and where you are with your budget is.
Exactly. And so it also forces you, I think, to start looking at your accounts on a more regular basis.
Yeah.
If you're just doing it monthly, there's 30 days that go between when you look at
semi-annually sometimes.
So you just the money goes in, you're getting paid, but you're not really paying attention to it. Where when it goes in and you're having to, okay, I know I have so much I can spend every week. Oh, this week I have a bit more.
Yeah. So day to day would be a little bit too overbearing. Month to month is not enough, and then weekly is that sweet spot.
Weekly is where you tend to be able to stick with sort of the number you're giving yourself for those kind of just spending.
Yeah.
And then spend it on what you want, but you have so much to spend in that week.
Okay, so then what do I got to start looking at for planning out the cash flow then? We've got like the high emotional risk and the low emotional risk. How do you start organizing that?
Yeah, so I think, when we start thinking about a typical household, I would say the vast majority of the people I've worked with have joint household accounts. You do have people where it's like, my money's my money and you each have your own accounts. But, in a typical household where you have, both paychecks going into the joint bank account, and you'll have, your income being allocated to, first off, you're going to have a bunch of unconscious spending. That's where we're really trying to get a grip on in terms of the coffees, the restaurants, and all these other little things that come up. And then you have your bills, you have your mortgage, all that kind of stuff comes out. And the very last thing that ever happens is, savings for retirement or savings for the holiday. And so, where we can shift that, and you kind of take this, you change the model so that instead of doing it where everything is going into that one account and we're just spending it, and we're not sort of prioritizing some of our cash flow to certain goals or objectives that we might have. So you need to have a low effort approach to being able to keep track of this kind of stuff. And the way you kind of do that is you'd have your money going into, let's say, the joint account. But from there, we're going to allocate a certain amount to, say, an emergency fund, a certain amount to fund your short-term goals. Then we're going to have, so these are all the kind of low emotional risk of, spending more, right? And then you're going to start carving off some of that money into, or you're going to have your money going towards, say, debt payments, mortgage payments, that kind of stuff. Then and the key is to automate this. So it's not about just, okay, well, I'm going to go in there and do it. It's like, no, as soon as if your pay cycle, say, on the 15th of every month and let's say the 1st, you're going to automate this so that emergency fund gets funded, goals get funded, your bills get paid, and then you're going to set up a second account. And that second account is going to really be called your spendable account. And that spendable account is what you're going to do. And each week, you're going to move money from your joint account to that spendable account. And that spendable account is sort of, you can spend it on whatever, but it's got to cover your food, your coffees, and all that kind of stuff. So you're going to be a bit more disciplined about how that happens. And you do it each week. And again, that's automated. And so what you've done is, instead of making sort of the savings being an afterthought of whatever's left over, the residue of your cash flow for the month is now it's coming into the top. Your goals are being funded at the top. Your fixed costs, or your kind of non-emotional expenditures, your debts, your bills, utilities, mortgage, all that kind of stuff is coming off the top. And then you're carving off this other amount. And that's your spendable kind of fund money. And so what you've really done is you have this committed account, which is, again, those fixed costs, and your spendable account is sort of the emotional risk expenditures. And in that, what you've effectively done is you've gotten rid of a lot of that waste, because now you're looking, all your spendable money is coming out of a debit card, ideally, and you're checking your bank account and you're paying attention to that balance, and you're doing it every week. And that's going to help you stay on track. And I think it simplifies it, because instead of having to figure it out after the fact, everything's coming out first. The priorities are coming out first. The savings, the emergency fund, that kind of stuff. So it's reversing the order.
I kind of like that approach of, like, it pains me to give up the credit card points, right? Like, structuring it in this way, where you've got, like, your fund money account is like physically a debit account, and you just got to, like, come to terms with the fact that you're not going to get the Amex points. But then that really, like, I guess would simplify having to tabulate and do the mental math every week. Because now you're just looking at checking account, you check it quickly on your phone, you're like, okay, I got that much fund money allocated for the week. Versus, like, if you're doing it with a credit card style, which we traditionally have, you're removed from it, right? It's so obfuscated. It's like, okay, there's a bunch of pending transactions, and the balance doesn't equal the actual, like, what your bill that's due is, and it really makes it hard, unless, I don't know, maybe somebody's using QuickBooks every week to, like, reconcile their expenses and figure out where they're at.
That would be the exception.
Yeah.
I think the other thing about this is the exercise is a pretty healthy exercise to go through in a household. It can do a lot to help bringing, spouses, hopefully you can find some common ground, because money can often be the source of a lot of, tension sometimes in families, in terms of you might have someone who's a saver and doesn't have this issue, and you have the person who likes to enjoy the more emotional spending and unplanned spending, and just likes to do things without kind of thinking about potential consequences. And I think it's a good exercise to go through that can help bring people onto the same page. And not just that, I think it's probably helpful for a lot of kids to, when they understand how mom and dad are doing it, it would be helpful for them to understand, like, how much you can spend out of what you make and how you should prioritize things to make sure you don't get into these traps.
Let's assume I implement this style of actually managing the cash. We'll just accept I'm not getting the Amex points. We're going to start using multiple debit accounts, perhaps one for my wife, one for myself, so that they're separated. You know what each one is spending. Like, what could you reasonably expect in terms of improvement to your cash flow? Or I guess, like, attributing more towards your long-term goals as opposed to that emotional spending?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting when you start looking at this. I would say the average household, and these numbers are going to be before looking at any sort of doing anything with debt, and maybe whether it's reorganization, refinancing, without considering that. So the average household is of say $250,000 of household income. You're finding about $4,300 a month. And so you start to take that number and you assume, okay, if we took half of that $4,300 a month and invested that, let's say, at 6% for 20 years, what does that amount to? Well, it's almost $1 million, right? And again, I think when you start thinking about a dual income household, physicians or professionals who are, various levels of income, but it's not hard to see where you can get into $400,000, $500,000 of household income. In those situations, $400,000 of household income, on average, you're seeing about $7,200. And again, you start looking at what that compounds to over 20 years. If you can just take half of those savings and allocate that to retirement or to investing, 1.6, 1.7 million over 20 years. So it has a huge impact.
So it's more than going to justify the Amex points and the extra $10 a month for a separate checking account.
100%. And I think, it starts to also, you'll get excited when you start to run those numbers, because it's helping you move to where we all want to be, is eventually retire. There's not very many people that say I want to work till I'm 80.
You get a few physicians that like that.
Yeah, there's a few. There's a few people who will end up doing that. Sorry, and I think the reality is most don't. So I think setting yourself up early. The other thing is the time value of money. It's you have that ability to invest a lot longer, and it takes a lot more money later in life to save every month versus starting early. And again, it's not an income problem. It's usually just a spending, where we're spending.
Like you mentioned earlier, yeah, it's not like I didn't make enough money this month. It's just a matter of where the heck did it all go.
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense in terms of the budgeting, the cash flow planning. How do you actually fit debt into that then? Like, I've got line of credit, it's a guaranteed return on investment for any cash that I just put in there. How do you manage to, or how do you recommend people start tackling debt?
Yeah, so there's a few things to touch on here. I think when you start thinking about debt, there's the common ways that a lot of people will go about it is there's an avalanche method and there's the snowball method. You can also look at debt, refinancing or unification in terms of rolling more of your debts into one debt type thing. And with the avalanche method, we'll touch on that first. But really, what that is you're tackling your highest interest debt first. So you're going to probably save the most money. It can be a little bit more challenging if it's a larger debt, because you have it could take a while to really feel the results of it. But certainly will save you the most over time. And once the first debt is paid off, then you would just roll whatever funds into the next debt. So you tackle your highest interest or highest cost debt and move on to the next, and it works well. But it's going to save you the most, but it can be hard if those first debts that you're trying to take care of are a bit large.
It feels like a drop in the bucket. Yeah.
Yeah,
so
you just feel like you're not
wanes.
getting anywhere. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then so that you get into, I think when you get into the snowball method, which is, you take your smallest debt, you pay it off first, and then you go to the next one. So you get that sort of sense of accomplishment and reward. The one thing, I think the snowball method has been proven to have a bit better adoption with people, because you do have that sort of loop that you're making progress, right? There's pros and cons to both, but I think either one will work. You have to kind of figure out for your personality type what you think you can stick with, and maybe the magnitude. Like if you have a huge high interest debt, if you think you can't stick with it because it'll just be too hard, then start with something and get some success. And again, you're just paying the minimum payments on the other stuff
Yeah.
and focusing on the one that you're choosing. So whatever method, whether it's a snowball or the avalanche.
Yeah, I guess it depends what your bottleneck is. Specifically, if it's enthusiasm and willingness to save, or if it's just the debt load itself.
Yeah, I mean, some people would feel like it's like enduring a bunch of pain, which is not what we want. We want, like, the ideal situation is you feel like you're having success and you stick with it.
Yeah.
It's like going to a personal trainer and saying, okay, we'll do all this stuff, but if you can't do it, you make it too much of a time commitment. You need 2 hours a day to do it. Well, that's great. Not everyone has 2 hours in their day to do it. So, you need something that you can, if you can do it 3 or 4 times a week and it only takes half an hour, that might be all you need to kind of stick with something. So I think that's the big thing, is being able to stick with it.
Maybe that's where my wife and I need to revisit our strategy, because sometimes it's disheartening, I guess. You've just answered the door and it was the second box from Sephora that showed up that she ordered that day, or from Amazon.
Yeah, exactly.
And then I'm like, well, I guess I might as well buy the little goofy thing that I wanted to do. And then when you think of like, okay, I'm just putting the rest towards this giant chunk of debt, it's easy to just sort of lose steam of like, okay, I guess I don't care this month, and then now we're way off base.
And I think that's a really good point too, is it's really important that you can get both parties on the same page. It wouldn't be hard to see how you can get resentment or tension where one person feels like they're sacrificing everything and the other person hasn't sacrificed anything.
She would argue that the Sephora delivery was one of those unemotional needs.
Gotcha. Well, there's going to be certain things you're just going to have, and you're going to have to figure out how to fit it in. And I think the one thing that we didn't touch on earlier, when we start looking at that spendable amount, there's a range. It's not a hard number. You can adjust it. If you're finding that, it's set too low and you're really struggling, you can adjust it. It's going to change, how much is being allocated to your goals and some of those other things. But it's not rigid. There is a range that you can still achieve goals. It just might change at how quickly you can reach those goals. And so that covers off the avalanche and the snowball method. But then when you start talking about debt unification, it's taking a whole bunch of different debts that sometimes various interest rates, and ideally what you're doing is averaging down your interest rate over time. Like, so if you consolidate these debts or roll them into one, you can lower your overall interest cost. The one thing that's sometimes a concern when you do that is, if you still have credit cards with large balances, it's not like let's double down and go spend a bunch more. Like, it's now that you stick with that focused repayment. But when you're looking at the debt side, you can often unlock more. So that's on top of those numbers that we were looking at earlier. So like, how many physicians wind up being in a position to consolidate debt? Like, does that often happen where you've got, I don't know, line of credit and vehicle payment and mortgage and government student loan? How often does it make sense to like refinance everything? Well, so for one thing, I would say you're not necessarily going to look at refinancing vehicle loans, and you're not going to likely refinance student loans because you have tax credits that are related to the interest cost. So other debts, though, credit cards, line of credit, I think it depends on where you're at. If you're just out of school, you don't have an asset base necessarily, so you don't have equity in your home. If you end up having equity in your home, that's often what you're going to be using to kind of arrange for this sort of stuff to be done efficiently and get you the lowest rate, because it'll be a secured loan. So it depends on where you're at. The reality is, though, the banks are going to be pretty keen to lend new grads more money, even if it's on a line of credit. So if you find yourself with $40K in credit card because the last year or so you had more going up on the credit card and running up, say, against the line of credit balance that you have, that's when you probably want to look at that, because your credit card is probably going to be at 20+%, and your line of credit unsecured might be 7, 8, 9%, depending on where you're at. But certainly better than what you get from the credit card.
So depending if you have where your debt is, it might make a lot of sense to reunify. What's it called? Reunify?
Unification.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, most probably commonly people would think of that more as like, debt consolidation, but maybe that has more of a negative connotation. But at the end of the day, you're trying to take a whole bunch of multiple payments, focus it down to one, lower the overall rate. Sometimes in doing that, though, you're extending the timeline, so that's where you want to be smart about it.
Yeah.
You can stretch it out for 25-year amortization. Well, now you're just paying for that for a really long time, versus if you keep it to a higher cash flow commitment, but in shorter amortization, you'll be able to get that debt down faster. And I think the key thing is not to go out and use your credit cards for those kind of purchases where you rack it up again.
Yeah, that's a terrible idea, generally speaking, as far as interest rates go. So last week you sent me the Winton tool, and that's to actually start looking at the cash flow. So I've been going through and like putting in the like fixed costs and those just unemotional things, and then as well as sort of some estimates on those more optional pieces and what historical averages have been. Once this is all finished, it's still a work in progress, I'm not done with it yet, how do you then take that and the output there and fit that into the bigger picture for the long-term budgeting and planning and getting to those goals?
Mm-hmm. So there will be a link available either on my profile on Cherry Health or tied to the video. And Winton is basically a tool that you can use to input these costs. And it's going to tell you, it's not going to give you full access to it, but what it's going to do is it's going to tell you roughly how much money you might be able to find by applying the principles that we've talked about in today's show. And with that, then we would take that information and make sure it's accurate. And if people want to engage, so someone wants to engage in some, cash flow planning for themselves to kind of get a handle on things and kind of get good habits going, then we can work with you on that and help you kind of build it out. Also look at if there's any refinancing opportunities or unification opportunities. And so basically the real important thing to make sure that you're getting a good output is have the details. So the more accurate you are, the more accurate it'll kick up the numbers that we were talking about earlier, where meaningful savings. And so that is what kind of ties into all your shorter term goals. And so that should really be at the front end. And if we're going to do anything after that, then we can get into more comprehensive planning, where it's going to take some of what we find out of that exercise to tying that into longer term goals. So retirement, estate planning, maybe you want to buy a cabin 5 years from now or 10 years from now, and that kind of stuff. So how do we make those things happen and build that into your more comprehensive plan? It's still cash flow planning, but it's more longer term. So we need to keep the focus on the things that we can control in the near term, which will lead to compounding impacts of helping you kind of get to those goals.
So in the short term, it's more about okay, how do we clean up the chaos and organize some of the messiness and get rid of that just frivolous impulse purchasing. And then at the end of the day, okay, now we've got a pretty good idea for how much cash we've actually got month to month. And then we start looking at our really longer term future facing goals and kind of working backwards as to how to allocate that free cash now.
Exactly. And I think, how many people do you know don't want their money to work more for them?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody would disagree.
Exactly, right. And so that's the whole idea. It's really tying it to those things that, how do we get more out of the resources you have? Yeah. And this front end is so important to that. And the earlier you start, the more of an impact it's going to have on you 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
How much do you notice the difference of the pre-post of going through the plan and the Winton tool and all that emotional retail therapy that we've been doing? Was it truly making people happy? Do they notice once you start removing that?
I think how many people haven't had buyer's remorse?
It's all the time.
Right? We've all done it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all subject to the same impulses. So we buy things and we realize, damn, I wish I didn't do that, right?
Yeah.
That was dumb, shouldn't have done it. So you start adding that up over time. So yeah, we waste, everyone wastes a lot of money if they're not careful about it. And it's just, I think the number, the buy-in, so the first part is like realizing how much you might be wasting.
Yeah.
You start applying that to, okay, what does that mean for how quickly I can pay off my debt, but also how, I get to do this, and then I can have my next, say, short-term goal of I want to go on this trip. So it's tying rewards, and it helps you live more. I would say it helps you live a better life because you're actually just being more direct and more purposeful with the resources you have. And so you can start to do more travel versus putting it off because you think you can't, or you're in this sort of vicious circle. And I think that is where the rewards come. And then you start looking at when you start saying, okay, how much am I going to have, or when can I retire? These impacts of doing this, say, early on, say the first 2 to 5 years of being out of school, will have enormous impact on you because you might be able to shave a decade off the back end.
Yeah, so I guess the short-term delay in happiness that you miss out on buying the Costco radio control car in the toy aisle, you're still like going to have meaningful short-term goals that you're making actual significant progress towards that you're looking forward to instead.
Yeah, but I think you mentioned like short-term pain. I don't think it has to be short-term pain. I think it's prioritizing.
Yeah.
And if you have something, if you have the right goals that you're excited about, you'll and you can feel like they're achievable, but there's something that you can't do now, that's what's going to get you excited about it.
Yeah.
So I think it's, picking the right things, the right rewards for the behavior that you're trying to encourage yourself to take on will allow it to become achievable.
Okay. The other part of it too, I think, is just like the organizing it in a way that's got buy-in from both my wife and myself, so you don't feel like you're unilaterally doing it, and then vice versa. If she's having a good month and I'm having a bad month, spending wise, she's not going to be getting discouraged that the sieve is leaking out the other end.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is when you do this exercise, it doesn't mean you do it once and you don't do it again. I think your income might change over time. Maybe you have a spouse that's got to have a longer kind of career ramp up for earnings. Well, you should be revisiting this probably annually because it's going to tell you a bit more and where you can allocate, how much you can. And again, it's not a rigid process. And so that's where I think, that's where the buy-in comes in. Like you might have one person who wants to push it to the extreme. That's not going to work. Like if you push it to the extreme of, too much restraint where you're going to be miserable, and again, you're not going to stick with it. So it's I think finding that balance, and you might not get it right the first go. You might have to play around with the number, but there's a range where you can still achieve these things and feel like it's you don't feel like you're giving things up. And I think that's the key, is just, and it'll be unique to each household.
You got to make it fun along the way, I guess.
Exactly, and again, I think that's where like having those little wins, whether it's the 6-month goal on an 18-month, or maybe you could say we have that bigger trip 18 months out, but we're going to throw in a nice weekend away every 2 months or something. It'll depend on your situation, right? But I mean, but it'll give you those things to look forward to, and you're not using borrowed funds to do it.
Okay.
Right? Because if you don't do it, you still want to go on those holidays. You're going to treat yourself, but what are you going to do? Okay, the credit card comes out again, and guess what? There's 10 grand for, trip for 2 for a week or whatever it is, right?
There's got all these like fun short-term things now going through my head of all these things to look forward to.
if it ends up where you can move the needle and kind of move your objectives forward, and stick with it, it's a win. That's how I would approach it. I think when it comes to the amount of money the average household, and I would say particularly the professional demographic, will find, it's going to be pretty sizable, even with big debts. And you're going to find that there's probably a fair bit of money that's low-hanging fruit that you can just use and repurpose for things that are going to be better use and align with your family's goals. And I think it's this mindset of purpose, like having purpose. Like you work hard, right? Like you know your work week is going to be busy. Do you want to keep doing that forever? No. So it's like how do we make this rewarding for us and strike that balance between the short and long term and the now.
I think I've been approaching it wrong from like it's just those really long term sort of goals, and then that middle ground was kind of missing, and then that's where the impulsive, frivolous pleasures started to come in terms. It's just like, okay, that's shift that time frame out by a few months or a year kind of thing. Now you've got something more exciting to be working towards.
I think it's one of those things where long-term goals are important, but it's the journey as well. And I think that's, again, I think often we have enough. It's just figuring out how to use it more effectively.
Yeah.
Really. And I think, I am a big fan of, the journey, not just the destination, because you can go through your entire life looking for the end and end up really disappointed for various reasons. And I think this is like, how do you live a life of purpose, but move everything down the road?
Yep.
And I think the one thing about this whole approach is it's not just saying it's all going towards debt. You're balancing it between, maybe emergency fund. Once you have an emergency fund that's established, that's sufficient for your household needs, then you're moving that money to more goals, or more debt, or a combination of the two. So it's not about not having fun. It's just like doing it the right way.
Okay, I'm getting more and more excited for it. I'll make sure to finish off the Winton tool thing for this week, and then we can follow up on that. But that makes a lot of sense of like framing it from that perspective.
Yeah, it's kind of going from a I don't know if it's the right way. What I'm thinking of is like a scarcity mindset of like I don't want to give this up, to an abundance mindset where I have enough, but it's just figuring out and doing the things that you want to make it attainable.
Yep.
And sustainable. So, I think the one thing that we haven't touched on yet, is how this could also tie into maybe some other, I think, areas where in the medical profession they could feel some benefit from, in terms of, we hear a lot about burnout, and with that, I don't think finance is going to be the primary cause of the burnout, but I think it piles on top of things that we have on our life, whether it's, finance or family and everything else. So when you already have a stressful profession, if we can alleviate that finance risk, it's just one less thing that you're carrying on your shoulders and having to deal with. And I think that could go a long way of just, it's like little successes, little wins will help alleviate, I think, some of that stress.
Well, I think there certainly would be a component of financial pressure as far as burnout goes, right? Because you graduate, you've got debt, and then you've got that pressure. You feel compelled to, more is better in terms of work. It's going to get me towards those goals faster. But then at the same time, now you start getting that, like, you're feeling used up at the same time, versus if you're approaching it up front of like, okay, here is the long-term goal, what's actually needed, in terms of retirement or in terms of debt payments or whatever those goals actually look like. Now you've got a little bit more defined of what do you actually need today, workload wise, hours wise, versus just that more is better, which you graduate, and then that starts to set the tone for how you practice, right? You start getting used to that level, and so where you kind of calibrate yourself early on, I think probably does make a big difference there.
100%. And I think trying to keep up with friends, if so and so he bought a nice car, or got a golf membership already, and right away it's like, it's not that those things are bad, it's just is the timing right, and is it a priority for you? And I think if you can give yourself that freedom to say, okay, I don't need to do that extra shift, I don't need to make an extra $75,000 or $100,000 working more. Prioritize the things that probably should be more important. Is if you have a family, are you spending more time with your family? I mean, you can. There's lots of cases where certain professions and physicians might be one, but there's a whole bunch of other where you end up spending 70 hours a week, 80 hours a week working. You have a lot of money. You have no relationship with your spouse. You end up divorced and you lost half of it. Is that the right way? Is that where you want to end up, right? So it's like, I think it's striking that balance. And I think if you find that balance where you're not feeling you have to push so hard, you're probably going to feel like you can work longer too, like longer in your career, because you're not going to have as much burnout because you have the balance in, other parts of your life where you've got time with family, friends, and the reset for you.
Yeah, well, I think perhaps that's why it makes a lot more sense to figure it out up front, right? If it's, okay, here's the goal, here's what I want to accomplish by the time I'm 40, 50, 60, 70, whatever time scale you're looking at it at, and then it's like, okay, well, you could just work 80% as hard and still hit that, and have 3-day weeks or 3-day weekends every week, or shorter days here and there, so you can actually enjoy the other parts of your life, time with loved ones, extracurricular activities, hobbies, things like that.
Exactly.
Right? That might make all the difference.
Exactly. And I think, again, this is more of a pressure we put on ourselves in society. We always try to do more. We try to do more for our kids.
More is better. Right?
More activities, so then we spend, 25 hours, 30 hours a week running 2 or 3 kids around if you have them. And again, it leads to burnout and not being able to invest in yourself. And I think if we can just find that delicate balance between the now and the future, and then create that time to reset, I think more people will find you're not as stressed out about all these other things. And it's just part of it is we do it to ourselves, right? Try to do too much.
Yep.
Set some boundaries. Say no. You can't do everything.
It's part of the med school grading curricula for every block you're on, was just recognizing your own limitations. They're very adamant that was important.
We all try to do too much, or most of us try to do too much. I think we just figure out how to scale that back just a tiny bit.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean you can do it right away, but if you have an approach or a goal of how do I free up those time or those hours to reclaim hours to reset, and again, it's more sustainable. I think it leads to probably a happier life and probably better relationships, both friends, family, and kids and everything, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
I think that's a huge win. I don't know how you put a price on that too. At the end of the day, I think I'd rather have that than have a bigger bank account.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so perhaps, Sean, could you give us a recap then for today? Because we covered a lot of material so far, from the budgeting to the cash flow to the long-term goals. If a person wants to start looking at it from the short-term perspective of what do I do this month, this week, how do they start tying that into the bigger picture of those long-term goals and meaningfully making progress there?
Yeah, so I think the real important part is to, if you feel if this sounds like you, where how much money comes into your account but you don't know where it all goes, this is probably a good exercise for anyone who kind of falls into that camp. And then if you're wanting to really have an impact on your financial situation, then go through the questions on the Winton app. It'll tell you roughly how much you can find. And then it's about how do we define those goals so they're meaningful for you to make sure you can, achieve them and you're going to stick with it. And I think that is sort of that making a conscious decision to kind of change how you go about, or your relationship with money and your cash flow from month to month, and making sure you have purpose. And I think if that's something you're interested in, the exercise will be worthwhile, and it should give you a bit more peace of mind in terms of that you can get to where you want, and it doesn't have to be painful. I think that's the key part is, it's not going to be hard if you have some goals that you're actually motivated to achieve, that have that emotional response. And I think, just taking that step now, the compounding impact will be huge. So I'd encourage people to do it. I think probably 60-70% of the population would benefit from this. And it's just I think it sets you up to have success and freedom. So I that would be where I tee it up and just say, if you're really worried about it, or you want to get control of things and just feel like you're in control versus just existing, then do the quiz, do the online tool. It'll help give you a better idea. If you want to engage the help at that point, you can choose, or you can try to figure it out by kind of touching on some of the slides we talked on today, and try to find that and build that purpose into your cash flow now.
Well, Sean, thank you so much for the wisdom again today. Personally, I'm looking forward to the next steps here. I'll get the Winton tool finished off for you. I'm curious to see how you tie it in with that personality quiz that you sent me, because that was amusingly accurate. It was like, you read your horoscope and you're like, wow, it knows me so well.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see how you tie that in with the actual cash flow planning.
Well, we'll find out when you get the rest done. We'll go through that exercise, and again, it's pretty powerful. It's relatable.
Absolutely, very.
So, thank you very much. It's great being on today.
Looking forward to the next steps. Thanks again, Sean.
Yeah, thanks.